I had been needing a break for a while. Work was grinding me down, life was starting to feel like a copy of the day before, and I felt like if I didn't get out, I was gonna crack. So when my buddy offered me the use of his family's old cabin up north for a week, I jumped at it. I packed my truck the night before I left. Warm clothes, some basic food, camping gear, my old shotgun just in case something came sniffing around, though he told me the worst I'd probably see was raccoons. I didn't expect anything crazy. I just wanted quiet. The drive out there took about 5 hours. Most of it was on the highway, but the last stretch was a mess of pothole-filled dirt roads that got narrower the further I went. Trees pushed close to the sides, scraping the truck with long, dry fingers of bare branches. It was late fall, cold but not frozen yet. Everything was brown and gray and dead-looking. I liked it. It felt empty in a way that was relaxing after so many months of noise and people. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I sat in the truck for a minute and just looked at it. It was smaller than I'd expected. Just a single-story building with a sagging roof and peeling paint. There was a little porch with 2 broken chairs, and the steps creaked when I got out to check the place out. The front door was stiff, but I got it open after a bit of shoulder work. Inside, it smelled old, like dust and wood and something faintly rotten that I couldn't place. But it wasn't bad, just old. There was a little living room right when you walked in. A cracked leather couch, a wood stove in the corner, and a battered coffee table with a few old magazines on it. The kitchen was through a doorway, tiny, with a gas stove and a little fridge that wasn't plugged in. There was one bedroom with a bed that looked way too soft and saggy for comfort, and a bathroom with a cracked mirror and a toilet that needed to be pumped to work. No cell service out there either, but I'd expected that. I dumped my bags in the bedroom and started setting up. I lit a fire in the wood stove, cracked open a can of soup, and spent the evening reading an old book I'd brought. The place creaked a lot, the walls shifting in the cold, the occasional thump from the roof as something fell from the trees, but it didn't bother me. I figured I'd sleep like a rock. That first night, I woke up once to a sound outside. It was just a quick scraping sound, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. I lay there, blinking in the dark, listening. Nothing, just the ticking of the cooling stove and the pop of the fire dying down. I told myself it was a raccoon or a branch and rolled over. The next morning was cold and gray. I cooked some eggs on the gas stove, made some coffee, and decided I'd spend the day exploring the woods around the cabin. There was an old trail that started a little ways behind the building, mostly overgrown but still walkable if you didn't mind pushing through brush. I spent hours out there wandering. The forest felt different from the ones I grew up around. Thicker, heavier. The trees were older, gnarled and twisted, and there were fallen logs covered in moss that looked like they'd been lying there for decades. I didn't see another soul all day. No houses, no hikers, not even a plane overhead. Just the sound of my boots on the leaf litter and the occasional crow cawing in the distance. I found a creek about 2 miles out and sat there for a while, just listening to the water. When I headed back, the sun was already dipping low, and everything was starting to get that dim, washed-out look. I hadn't brought a flashlight, stupidly, so I picked up my pace. When I got back to the cabin, the first thing I noticed was that the front door was open. I was sure I'd shut it. It had been stiff when I closed it, and I remembered having to yank it hard to get the latch to catch. Now it was swinging gently in the breeze. I stood there for a minute, just staring at it. The woods around me were quiet. That weird, heavy quiet you get sometimes when a storm's about to break. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anything, but my stomach dropped all the same. I pulled the shotgun from the truck and went up the steps as quietly as I could. Inside, everything looked the same. My bag was still on the bed. The firewood was still stacked by the stove. But the feeling in the room was different, like someone had been there and left, but the air hadn't had time to settle yet. I shut the door, locked it, and jammed a chair under the handle for good measure. I didn't want to freak myself out, so I told myself maybe the latch hadn't caught properly after all. Maybe the wind had blown it open. I tried to believe that. I spent the rest of the evening keeping the shotgun close at hand, though. That night, I woke up again. It was just past 3 in the morning, according to my watch. This time, the sound was louder. It was a dragging sound, right outside the window by the bed. long and slow, like something heavy being pulled through the dirt. I didn't move. I just lay there, heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. The window had an old, yellowed curtain over it, and I couldn't see out unless I moved it. Part of me wanted to look. Part of me wanted to just stay still and hope whatever it was would go away. The dragging sound stopped. Then, there was a soft tapping on the glass. 3 slow taps. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just waited. Eventually, after what felt like forever, the sound stopped. I lay there until the sky started to lighten with the coming dawn. When I finally got up the courage to look out the window, there was nothing there. Just the trees and the thick, wet leaves on the ground. But there were marks in the dirt. Long, thin drag marks that started right under the window and disappeared into the woods. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I chopped some firewood, kept busy, but I kept checking the trees, expecting to see someone standing there, watching. I didn't, but that feeling of being watched never really went away. I thought about leaving, packing up and driving home, but I didn't want to feel like I'd run from nothing. I kept telling myself it had to be an animal. Maybe a deer rubbing its antlers against the side of the cabin, or a raccoon scratching at the window. Maybe the marks were from a branch getting dragged by the wind. I tried to believe that. That night, I set up a few little traps around the cabin. Simple ones like stacking cans on a string so they'd rattle if someone moved through them. It was probably stupid, but it made me feel better. I slept with the shotgun on the floor next to the bed. I woke up again sometime in the early morning hours. This time it wasn't a sound that woke me. It was the cold. The fire in the stove had gone out, and the cabin was freezing. I got up, shivering, and went to the stove to build it back up. I was crouched down, feeding wood into the stove, when I heard something soft behind me. A breath. Close. I spun around so fast I fell on my ass, heart hammering in my chest. But there was no one there. Just the empty room, the sagging couch, the cracked coffee table. I stayed up the rest of the night, shotgun across my knees. In the morning, I found the traps I'd set had been disturbed. The cans were scattered across the porch, the string snapped. But nothing else seemed touched. No footprints that I could see. No broken windows. No scratches on the door. I decided then that I was leaving. I didn't care if it made me feel like a coward. Something wasn't right out there. I packed up quick, shoving my stuff into my bag without even folding it. I loaded the truck, checked the back seat, double-checked it, then locked the cabin behind me. I felt a little better once I was driving. Once the cabin was shrinking away in my rearview mirror. I hadn't gone more than 2 miles down the dirt road when I saw something. At first, I thought it was just another fallen tree branch. There were a lot of them, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a branch. It was a rope, stretched across the road, tied to 2 trees on either side. At head height, I slammed the brakes, skidding a little in the loose dirt. I sat there for a second, breathing hard. Someone had set that up. Someone had set it up to catch a car coming down the road. If I hadn't seen it in time, it would have caught my windshield, maybe even my neck if it shattered through the glass. I got out, shotgun in hand, and carefully untied the rope. It was thick, dirty, like it had been lying out in the woods for a while. There were no tracks I could see nearby, but the woods pressed close to the road, thick and dark. Anyone could have been standing 10 feet back and I'd never see them. I threw the rope in the bed of the truck and got back behind the wheel. I didn't stop again. I didn't even slow down. I just kept driving, hands tight on the wheel, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. I didn't see anything following me. No cars, no people, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there, just out of sight, watching, waiting. When I finally hit the highway, when the trees fell away and the road opened up, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't stop until I was back home, and even then, I locked every door and window, double-checked them twice, slept with the shotgun loaded and close by. I never went back to that cabin, never asked my buddy about it, never told him what happened. Some places just have something wrong with them, even if you can't explain it. And sometimes you realize you're not as alone out there as you think you are. The only thing that still gets me, the thing I can't stop thinking about, even now, is this: When I left the cabin, I decided to take a break from everything one weekend and rent out an old cabin deep in the woods. It wasn't one of those fancy vacation cabins with clean kitchens and hot tubs. It was a real old cabin. Wooden floors that creaked with every step, drafty windows, and the faint smell of mold in the corners. It was cheap too, probably because it was so isolated. You had to drive about 6 miles off the main road, along a dirt trail barely wide enough for my truck. The nearest neighbor was probably a mile or two away, and even then, it was just another cabin sitting alone in the woods. When I pulled up, the late afternoon sun was already slipping down toward the tree line. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. Everything felt still. Even the birds were quiet. I grabbed my backpack, slammed the truck door shut harder than I meant to, and headed up to the front porch. The boards sagged a little under my weight. The cabin looked even rougher up close than it had online. Peeling paint, rusted hinges, a screen door hanging crooked. I had to shove hard to open the main door. Inside, it was darker than I expected. There was a dusty living room with an old plaid couch, a stone fireplace with a few blackened logs still sitting inside from the last person, and a tiny kitchen in the corner with a cracked fridge and a 2-burner stove. The bedroom was just a mattress on a frame in the back, covered in a faded blue blanket. No TV, no radio, no cell service. That was fine. That was the whole point. I wanted quiet. After throwing my stuff down, I opened some windows to air the place out. A few spiders dropped from the corners. I killed the ones I saw and tried not to think about the ones I didn't. I spent a while stacking some firewood that was piled against the side of the house, then went inside to cook a can of soup on the stove. As night fell, the woods outside turned from green to black. No moon that night, and the trees were thick enough that it would have been dark anyway. I sat by the fire for a while, reading an old paperback I found on the shelf. The only sound the occasional crackle from the fireplace and the low whine of the wind pushing against the windows. Around 9, I got tired and decided to turn in. I checked the doors, one front door, one back door near the kitchen. Both had simple locks. Nothing fancy, but enough. I figured nobody was out there anyway. The first night passed without much. I woke up once around 3 because I thought I heard something moving outside. It wasn't loud, just a faint crunch, like a footstep on gravel. I lay there for a while, staring at the dark ceiling, heart beating harder than it should have been. Probably a raccoon, I told myself. Maybe a deer. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning was cool and bright. I made some instant coffee and sat out on the porch. Everything looked normal. If anything, it was beautiful. The woods stretching out in all directions, morning mist rising from the ground, birds finally making noise again. I shook off the weird feeling from the night before, probably just nerves from being alone. After breakfast, I decided to hike around a bit. There was a narrow trail that wound away from the cabin and disappeared into the trees. I spent most of the day out there, not really going anywhere, just walking. The deeper I got, the quieter it became. No traffic, no voices, no signs of people at all. Just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional snapping twig. I kept an eye on the sun and turned back when it started to dip. I didn't want to get caught out there in the dark. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something weird. My backpack, which I had left sitting by the door inside, wasn't where I left it. It was moved about 2 feet closer to the couch. I stood there, just inside the door, staring at it. Maybe I bumped it when I left that morning? Maybe it slid across the floor when the wind blew through the cracks? I tried to make sense of it. I didn't want to think about any other options. I made another fire that night. I sat closer to it than I had the night before. I didn't read. I just listened. The woods felt different somehow. Heavier, more tense. Around 10, I shut everything down, locked the doors again, and went to bed. That night was worse. I woke up around 1 to a tapping noise. Soft, irregular. It took a second to realize it was coming from the window near my bed. The window had a thin, ratty curtain, and through the gaps, I could just barely see the shape of someone or something standing there. I froze. Every instinct I had screamed at me to move, to run, to hide. But I didn't. I just lay there, completely still, barely breathing. The tapping continued for a few seconds longer, then stopped. After that, nothing. I stayed awake until dawn, staring at the window, too scared to even pull the blanket over my head. When the first gray light of morning filtered through the trees, I finally got up. I forced myself to go outside. I half expected to see footprints or marks on the window, but there was nothing, just the wet grass and fallen pine needles. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but it felt stupid. Maybe I dreamed it. Maybe it was a branch tapping against the glass. I hated the idea of going back home and telling people I bailed because of some noises, so I stayed. I told myself I was fine. That afternoon, I decided to stay close to the cabin. I chopped some wood with a rusty axe I found behind the shed. I cooked some canned beans over the fire pit outside. I tried to act normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I looked up from what I was doing, I found myself scanning the woods, half expecting to see someone standing just beyond the trees. I never did, but that didn't make the feeling go away. As the sun dipped again, the fear grew stronger. This time, I didn't bother with the fire. I locked the doors, dragged the couch in front of the front door, and piled some chairs against the back door. It wouldn't stop anyone determined to get in, but it made me feel a little better. I didn't even try to sleep. I sat on the floor in the bedroom, back against the wall, a heavy flashlight gripped tight in my hand. The cabin was silent except for the occasional creak of the wood settling or a gust of wind pushing against the walls. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Not the slow, casual footsteps of someone walking by. These were deliberate, slow. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Getting closer. My heart hammered so loud I thought whoever was outside would hear it. The steps stopped right outside the bedroom window. I killed the flashlight and held my breath. The curtain shifted slightly. I saw the outline of a hand press against the glass. Fingers splayed wide, leaving smudges on the dusty surface. I stayed frozen. I didn't move a muscle. After a minute, the hand disappeared. The footsteps moved toward the front of the cabin. I heard the porch creak under the weight of someone stepping onto it. Then silence. I waited, straining to hear anything else. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, nothing. Still, I didn't move. Somewhere deep inside, I realized whoever was out there wasn't just messing around. They knew I was there. They had been watching, waiting. When the first pale light of morning appeared, I stood up on shaking legs. I didn't bother packing. I grabbed my keys, shoved the door open hard enough to bang it against the wall, and sprinted to my truck. The woods felt alive with unseen eyes. The truck started on the first try, thank God. I backed out so fast I nearly hit a tree, then tore down the dirt trail, bouncing over potholes, rocks slamming against the undercarriage. I didn't slow down until I hit the main road. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town. For days afterward, I kept thinking I saw someone following me, a car that seemed to turn when I turned, a figure standing too long at the corner of a gas station. It was probably nothing, or maybe it was just my mind still stuck in that place. I never went back to get my stuff. I never even called the rental office. I figured it was better that way. Months later, I read an article online. Apparently, a drifter had been living in abandoned cabins out in those woods, breaking in, watching people, sometimes stealing, sometimes worse. They caught him eventually, but not before a few people disappeared. I thought about the tapping on the window, the hand on the glass, the feeling of being watched. I knew I had gotten lucky. I knew if I had stayed just one more night, I wouldn't have made it out. I still have nightmares about that cabin, about those slow footsteps approaching the window, about that hand pressing against the glass. And every time I wake up, heart racing, I remind myself of one thing. Next time I want to get away from it all, I'll find a crowded hotel, somewhere with locks, cameras, neighbors, somewhere with people. Because some places are quiet for a reason, and sometimes you're not as alone as you think. I had been meaning to get away for a while. Life had been getting heavy on me lately. Long days at work, bills stacking up, barely sleeping most nights. I figured if I didn't step away, even just for a few days, I was going to burn out completely. So when I found a listing for an old cabin about 3 hours north, tucked away in the woods near a dried-up lake bed, it felt like a sign. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small wooden place, a little beat up from the pictures, but it looked clean enough inside. No TV, no internet, barely even a cell signal, which was part of the appeal. I needed peace more than anything. I packed light, a couple days worth of clothes, some canned food, bottled water, my pocket knife, a heavy flashlight, a lighter, a sleeping bag, even though the listing said the cabin had a bed. I filled my truck's tank and hit the road before dawn. The drive was easy at first, wide highways giving way to quieter backroads. By the time I was within 20 miles, the roads narrowed into cracked 2-lane stretches that wound through thick trees. There were no houses, no stores, nothing but woods pressing in on both sides. The cabin was harder to find than I thought it would be. The directions told me to turn off onto a dirt trail right after an old broken fence, but the fence looked more like a few collapsed boards thrown into the brush. The trail was barely wide enough for my truck, overgrown in spots with branches scraping the sides. I kept driving, the tires bumping over rocks and ruts, my gut tightening a little. It looked abandoned out here, wild in a way that felt different from the woods near town. After about a mile of crawling along that trail, I saw it. The cabin sat back in a little clearing, tilted slightly to one side like the ground had shifted underneath it. The wood siding was gray and rough, the roof sagging in the middle. The windows were dusty and covered with grime. A rusted metal chair sat tipped over on the porch. There was a heavy stillness to the place, like the trees around it had been holding their breath for years. I parked a few yards away and shut off the engine. The silence was immediate, not just quiet, dead silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. It made the hair on my arms stand up, but I told myself it was just because I was used to city noise. I grabbed my bag and walked up to the porch. The wooden steps creaked under my weight. The door was unlocked, just like the owner had said it would be. It swung open with a dry groan, the hinges shrieking a little. Inside, the air was stale and cool. Dust floated in the shafts of sunlight coming through the grimy windows. The place was small, one main room with a beat-up couch against one wall, a stone fireplace opposite it, and a kitchen area at the far end with an old sink and a 2-burner stove. There was a door on the right wall, probably the bedroom. I set my bag down by the couch and walked around, checking the place out. The bed was a simple metal frame with a stained mattress. No sheets or blankets. There was a tiny bathroom with a cracked mirror and a toilet that looked like it hadn't been flushed in months. No shower, just a sink that dripped steadily into a rust-colored stain. Still, it was good enough for a few days. I opened the windows to let some air in, coughing as dust billowed out. After a while, it didn't smell as bad. I unpacked my things and sat on the front porch, just listening to the silence. As the afternoon faded, the woods around me seemed to close in tighter. The sky turned a dull gray and a chill set in. I gathered some of the dead branches lying around and stacked them by the fireplace inside. When the sun dipped below the trees, it got dark fast. I hadn't realized just how dark it would be without city lights anywhere near. Even with my flashlight, the shadows inside the cabin felt thick and heavy. I made a small fire in the fireplace, the crackling was the only sound. Sitting there, staring into the flames, I felt the tension start to leave my body. I ate a cold can of beans straight from the can, too tired to bother heating it up. Afterward, I rolled out my sleeping bag on the couch, too wary of the bedroom's mattress. The fire died down to glowing coals. I turned off my flashlight to save the batteries and tried to fall asleep. But the cabin made noises in the dark. Slow creaks, the faint tap of something against a window. Every time I almost drifted off, a new sound would jolt me awake. I kept telling myself it was just the old wood contracting in the cool night air. Still, I barely slept. By the time dawn broke, I felt groggy and stiff. I stepped outside to breathe some fresh air. There were small tracks in the dirt by the porch, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. I didn't think much of it. I boiled some water on the stove for instant coffee and decided I'd spend the day hiking around the woods a little, just to clear my head. The trees were thick and tall, branches tangled overhead. Dead leaves crunched underfoot as I walked. I didn't go far, maybe half a mile, before I found the dried-up lake bed the listing had mentioned. It was just a wide stretch of cracked mud, broken up with weeds and fallen logs. In the middle of it, there was an old rowboat half buried in the dirt, rusted through and split open along one side. It looked like it had been there for years, forgotten by everyone. I climbed down into the lake bed and poked around. There wasn't much to see. Broken bottles, some rusted fishing gear, old footprints hardened in the dirt. It was eerily quiet down there, the tall trees blocking most of the wind. I stayed maybe 20 minutes before heading back to the cabin. When I got back, I noticed something strange. The door was open a few inches. I was almost sure I had pulled it shut when I left. Maybe the wind had caught it, but the air had been still all morning. I approached carefully, listening. No sound inside. I pushed the door open wider with the toe of my boot and stepped inside. Nothing seemed out of place. My bag was still by the couch. The firewood was stacked neatly. The windows were closed. I checked the bedroom and the bathroom, even looked under the bed. Nothing. I figured I was just rattling myself. Still, the feeling that someone had been there clung to me. The hairs on the back of my neck stayed up. I locked the door this time, using the little chain lock above the handle, and decided to stay close to the cabin the rest of the day. I spent the afternoon reading an old magazine I found stuffed in a drawer, sipping lukewarm coffee, and keeping the fire going. That night, the sounds came back worse than before. Sharp creaks along the floorboards, a soft scrape against the outside wall. Once, something tapped on the window nearest to the couch. A sharp, deliberate sound like fingernails. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart pounding, listening so hard my ears rang. I wanted to turn on the flashlight, but some part of me was too afraid to even move. Hours dragged by like that. I must have dozed off eventually, because I woke up to thin gray light seeping through the windows. I sat up slowly, my body stiff and aching. When I looked at the front door, my stomach dropped. The chain was still latched, but the door itself was cracked open again, pulled tight against the chain. Someone had tried to come in during the night. The metal chain was stretched tight, the screws holding it to the frame pulled loose a little. I felt cold all over. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't the wind. Someone had been trying to get in while I was asleep. I packed my bag in minutes. I didn't care if I had booked 3 nights. I needed to get out of there. I loaded everything into my truck, throwing glances over my shoulder the whole time. The woods felt too quiet again, like they were holding their breath. I got into the truck, locked the doors, and started the engine. The trail leading back to the main road seemed longer and rougher than I remembered. Every shadow between the trees felt like it was hiding something. My hands were tight on the steering wheel. Maybe 2 miles down the trail, I noticed something. The side mirror, the one on the passenger side, was gone, just ripped clean off. It hadn't been like that when I arrived. I hadn't hit anything either. I didn't know what to make of it. Finally, the trail ended and the cracked 2-lane road appeared. I turned onto it and floored it. I drove straight home, barely stopping for anything. When I got home and unpacked, I found something tucked into the side pocket of my bag. Something I hadn't put there. A small, folded piece of paper. My hands shook a little as I unfolded it. It was a torn scrap, probably from an old notebook. For words were scrawled across it in messy handwriting. "You shouldn't have come." That's when it hit me full force. Someone had been inside the cabin while I was sleeping. Someone had gotten close enough to touch my things. Maybe even close enough to be standing over me while I slept. I don't know what they wanted. I don't know what they would have done if the chain on the door hadn't held. I don't even want to think about it. I never told anyone what happened. It sounds too crazy, too much like something out of a bad horror movie. But I stopped going on trips alone after that. No more cabins. No more isolated woods. Sometimes, even now, years later, I wake up in the middle of the night and swear I hear the creak of floorboards, the soft scrape of something against the wall. I tell myself it's just the house settling. But deep down, I know better. I know that once you cross paths with something like I needed a break from everything. Work had been a mess for months, stress piling up every day, and even at night I couldn't turn my brain off. I wasn't sleeping much anymore, and when I did, I had these restless dreams that left me more tired than before. So when I finally got a few weeks off, I knew I didn't want to stay around the city. I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere where I didn't have to think about anything or anyone. I found a cabin listed online. It was cheap, about a 3-hour drive out into the woods. The ad said it was rustic, but that didn't bother me. I didn't need anything fancy. A roof, a bed, maybe a stove. That's it. I packed my truck with what I thought I'd need. Food, bottled water, a couple changes of clothes, some old paperbacks, a flashlight, and a few other things I grabbed without thinking too hard. I figured if I forgot something, I could just drive back out to town. I didn't plan on doing much once I got there. Mostly just sitting, sleeping, maybe hiking a little if I felt like it. The drive out was easy at first. Wide highways turned into smaller roads, which turned into cracked pavement, and finally into packed dirt. Trees got thicker the farther I went, the sky slowly shrinking between them. It had rained a day or two before, and the road was damp but not bad enough to get stuck. It smelled like pine and wet earth, clean in a way you just don't get near the city. I didn't see another car once I got past the last gas station. No other houses either, just woods pressing up against the road on both sides. I liked it. It made me feel like the whole world had shrunk down to just me and the trees. By the time I found the turnoff for the cabin, it was late afternoon. A hand-painted sign nailed to a post pointed down a narrower dirt track. I took it slow. Branches scraped the sides of my truck, and every pothole rattled the frame. I started to wonder if maybe I should have brought something bigger, but it was too late to turn around. After maybe 15 minutes of crawling along that track, the trees thinned a little, and I saw the cabin. It was smaller than I expected. More of a shack, really. The walls were weathered wood, gray with age, and the roof sagged a little in the middle. There was a small porch with 2 steps leading up to the door. One of the windows had a crack running across it, but it was boarded up from the inside. It didn't look like much, but it wasn't falling down either. I figured it would do. I parked in a flat spot next to the cabin and got out. The air was still and heavy. No wind, no birds either. I thought that was strange, but I told myself I was just used to the constant noise of the city. Silence felt bigger out here. It wrapped around you. Inside, the cabin was about as basic as it could get. 1 room, a bed in the corner, a small table with 2 chairs, a wood stove that looked ancient but solid, and some shelves with a few old pots and pans. No electricity, no running water. Just what I expected. There was a well out back, a big old-fashioned one with a crank and a bucket. I tested it and the water came up clear. Probably wouldn't taste great, but it was better than nothing. I spent the first few hours unpacking, getting a small fire going in the stove and settling in. I didn't have a cell signal out there, but that was part of the point. I checked my watch now and then, but after a while, even that seemed pointless. Time didn't matter out there. Light and dark were the only clocks that meant anything. The first night was colder than I expected. The fire burned down quicker than I thought it would, and I had to get up twice to feed it more wood. I hadn't brought enough blankets either, so I slept in my clothes, shivering a little under the thin covers. Every sound outside made me jerk awake. The creak of a tree, the rustle of something moving through the leaves. My mind kept trying to turn them into footsteps, but I told myself it was just animals. The second day, I went exploring a little. There was a faint path leading deeper into the woods behind the cabin. I followed it for a while, not really thinking about where it went. The trees were thick and tall, blocking most of the sky. Moss covered the trunks, and the ground was soft with layers of old needles and leaves. It was easy to get turned around, but I kept glancing back the way I came, marking little things in my mind. A crooked tree, a fallen log, a patch of ferns. I didn't want to get lost. After about an hour, I found a creek. The water was cold and clear, running fast over smooth rocks. I knelt and splashed some on my face. Felt good. For a while, I just sat there, listening to the sound of the water and the distant creaks of the forest. I didn't see any animals, but I could feel them out there, watching maybe. It wasn't a bad feeling exactly, just the sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought. Heading back took longer than it should have. The path seemed different somehow, like it had shifted while I was gone. I had to stop and retrace my steps more than once. At one point, I thought I caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees, something big and low to the ground, but when I looked again, there was nothing. Probably just a deer. I hoped so anyway. That night, I made sure the fire was stacked high before I went to bed. I kept the hatchet I had brought sitting next to me, just in case. I told myself it was silly. Nothing was going to happen, but it made me feel better. I woke up sometime after midnight. I didn't know what woke me at first. The fire was low, casting long, twitching shadows across the walls. I lay there listening. The woods outside were dead silent again. No wind, no animals, nothing. Then I heard it. A soft thud against the side of the cabin, like something heavy bumping into the wall. I sat up slowly. My heart started hammering in my chest. I reached for the hatchet, gripping the handle so tight my fingers hurt. I listened harder, barely breathing. Another thud, this time closer to the window. I stayed frozen for what felt like forever. The sound didn't come again. Maybe it was just a branch falling. Maybe an animal brushed against the cabin. It was probably nothing. Eventually, I lay back down, keeping the hatchet close. I didn't sleep much after that. Every creak and groan of the cabin made my skin crawl. The next morning, I went outside to look. There was nothing out of place. No tracks, no broken branches, just the same quiet woods, staring back at me. Still, something felt different, like the cabin wasn't as safe as it had seemed before. Like the woods were watching me a little closer now. I spent the day gathering firewood. I didn't want to be caught with a dead fire again. I worked until my arms ached, stacking the wood high inside the cabin. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something standing there, but there was never anything, just trees and shadows. That night, I barricaded the door with the table. It was stupid, but it made me feel better. I slept with the hatchet on my chest. Nothing happened, but I dreamed of footsteps crunching through the leaves, getting closer, and a heavy, slow breathing just outside the cabin walls. The days blurred together after that. I lost track of how long I'd been there. I tried hiking again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stopped, the woods seemed to hold their breath. Every time I moved, it felt like something was matching my steps, just out of sight. I started hearing noises at night too. More thuds, scraping sounds. Once, I thought I heard something trying the door handle. It rattled for a second, then stopped. I stayed curled up in bed, holding the hatchet like a lifeline, sweating despite the cold. I thought about leaving, packing up and driving back to town. But I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that if I left, I'd just be running from nothing. One afternoon, I decided to check around the cabin more carefully. I figured maybe some animal was coming around at night. Maybe if I scared it off, it would leave me alone. That's when I found it. About 20 yards into the woods behind the cabin, there was a small clearing. I hadn't seen it before. It was just a patch of trampled earth, ringed by trees. But in the center, there was something odd. A pile of stones stacked about waist high, neat, deliberate, and on top of the stones, there was a dead rabbit. His body torn open, blood soaking the rocks, flies buzzing thick in the air. It looked fresh, maybe a few hours old at most. I stared at it for a long time. I couldn't figure out what I was looking at. Some kind of predator kill? But why stack the rocks? Why leave it out like that? I didn't touch it. I just backed away slowly and went straight back to the cabin. I locked the door, shoved the table back against it, and fed the fire until it roared. That night was the worst. The sounds started early, scraping along the walls, soft, deliberate, like something dragging claws across the wood. I sat in the dark, clutching the hatchet, heart hammering so hard it drowned out everything else. Then the door shook, hard, like someone had thrown their weight against it. The table held, but I could hear the wood creaking. Another crash. It was supposed to be a simple weekend. That's what I kept telling myself as I drove up the long gravel road. Windows rolled down, the smell of pine heavy in the air. I had rented the cabin for 3 nights. No TV, no internet, no neighbors for miles. Just a place to sit with my own thoughts and maybe finally get some sleep. My work had been a nightmare lately, and my mind felt like it was tearing itself apart from stress. I figured if I didn't unplug for a few days, I was gonna snap. The cabin itself wasn't anything special. Small, square, plain. A flat roof that sagged a little in the middle. Dark brown paint peeling in strips. 1 window on each side, 2 small steps up to the front door. The listing had said rustic charm. I didn't care about charm. I just needed to be away. I pulled my truck into the clearing and parked close to the front porch. Before I even got out, I sat there for a second, just listening. There was nothing. No cars, no voices, not even any distant machinery or planes. Just a whisper of wind through the trees. It made me feel like I had stepped out of the world completely. I unloaded the few bags I brought. Some canned food, a case of bottled water, a couple of books, a flashlight, a knife, and a heavy jacket. Nights were still cold up here, even in late spring. The air had a sharpness to it, like it wasn't ready to give up winter just yet. Inside, the cabin smelled stale, like it had been closed up too long. Dust floated in the beams of sunlight cutting through the windows. The furniture was old and mismatched. A worn-out couch with sunken cushions. A tiny wooden table with 2 chairs. A cracked wood stove in the corner, with a rusty pipe running up through the roof. Against the back wall, a bed with a thin mattress and a few folded wool blankets. I opened all the windows first thing, trying to air it out. I didn't feel relaxed yet. Something about the place made my skin crawl. Maybe it was just being alone. Maybe it was how quiet it was. Too quiet, like the trees were holding their breath. I spent the first evening trying to settle in. I read a little, fixed myself a dinner of cold beans and crackers, and sat on the porch as the sun went down. The temperature dropped fast, and by full dark, I had the jacket on and was seriously thinking about trying to get the wood stove working. But I was tired, the kind of tired that weighs down your arms and legs. I figured I'd deal with it tomorrow. I locked the front door, one of those old doors with a simple bolt you slide into a slot, and dragged my bags closer to the bed. I tucked myself under the scratchy wool blankets and closed my eyes. That first night, I barely slept. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of the cabin settling, the scratching of tree branches against the roof. At one point, I heard what I swore was footsteps outside, crunching over the gravel, slow and deliberate. I lay perfectly still, heart hammering, listening hard. But after a while, it stopped. I told myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe. There were plenty around here. Could have been anything. I finally drifted off sometime before dawn. The next morning, I woke to pale gray light and a heavy feeling in my chest, like I hadn't gotten any rest at all. My back ached from the thin mattress. I made myself a breakfast of granola bars and instant coffee, standing at the little sink by the window. As I ate, I glanced outside and felt my stomach tighten. In the dirt, just a few feet from the porch, were tracks. They looked like boot prints. I swallowed hard. Maybe they were mine. Maybe when I was unloading the truck, I had walked around more than I remembered. I went out to check. The prints didn't match the tread on my boots. They were bigger, heavier, and the pattern was different, deep ridges that I didn't have. They led from the edge of the woods, around the side of the cabin, and disappeared behind it. I told myself it had to be an old trail. Maybe a hunter had passed through here weeks ago. It didn't have to mean anything. I tried not to let it bother me. The rest of the day, I kept myself busy. I hiked a little along the dirt roads, keeping the cabin in sight. I stacked some firewood I found behind the shed. I even managed to get a little fire going in the wood stove. It smoked at first, but once it caught properly, the cabin warmed up nicely. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, sure I would see someone standing at the tree line, half hidden in the branches. But there was never anything there, only the trees, dense and dark. That night, I bolted the door again and checked the windows twice. I turned off the flashlight and sat on the bed in the dark for a long time, just listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching over the gravel. They circled the cabin once, then stopped by the front door. I lay there, holding my breath. My knife was under my pillow. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stayed completely still. The doorknob rattled, just a little, like someone testing it. Then nothing. Minutes dragged by. Finally, I heard the steps move away. Not fast, just slow, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. When dawn finally broke, I jumped up and checked outside. More tracks, fresh ones. They led from the trees to the porch and back again. I had a decision to make. Pack up and leave early, or stick it out one more night. Stupid pride made me stay. I told myself it could still be a hiker or a hunter. Maybe someone who didn't realize the cabin was rented this weekend. Maybe a lost camper. I was probably freaking myself out for no reason. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't go hiking. I gathered more firewood, kept the stove burning strong, and tried to read, though I kept losing my place, mind wandering. The hours passed slowly. Shadows grew longer. I had this pit in my stomach all day, like I was waiting for something bad to happen. At dusk, I moved my truck closer to the cabin, nose pointed toward the road for a quick getaway. I kept the keys in my jacket pocket. I made sure the door was locked. I checked the windows. I kept the fire going, but I stayed away from the windows where the light could silhouette me inside. I sat in the dark, knife in my hand, heart hammering. This time, it started even earlier. Right after the last light drained from the sky, I heard the steps. Not cautious like before, bold, coming straight for the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I heard a scraping sound at the window, like a fingernail or a piece of metal dragging across the glass. Then silence. Then a heavy thump against the wall. Not a knock, more like a shoulder slam. The cabin shuddered slightly. Another thump, closer to the door. I gripped the knife so hard my fingers hurt. Then another sound, something bumping against the door, and a slow, soft clicking noise. I realized it was the bolt being slowly pushed and rattled. I sat there frozen, every muscle locked up, unable to think. Minutes passed, then footsteps moved away, then silence. I waited. I forced myself to count to 500 slowly to be sure. I finally got up and peered out through a crack between the curtains. The yard was empty. The trees were just black shapes against the dark blue sky. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting against the wall with the knife in my lap, shaking, staring at the door. When morning came, it was cloudy and cold. The wind had picked up. It rattled the roof and made the trees sway and groan. I went outside, shivering from more than just the cold. The tracks were back. Heavy boot prints, circling the cabin over and over. At least 4 or 5 loops around it. This wasn't someone lost. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone knew I was here. I didn't pack carefully. I threw my bags into the truck, slammed the door, and peeled out of the clearing so fast I nearly hit a tree. I didn't calm down until I hit the highway an hour later. I didn't tell anyone what happened for a long time. Felt like if I didn't talk about it, it would stay in the woods and not follow me home. But sometimes, even now, when I'm alone at night, I hear footsteps outside my window, and I wonder if whoever it was ever left those woods at all. Maybe they're just waiting. I was tired of the city. Every part of it wore me down. The noise, the crowded sidewalks, the smell of hot concrete and car exhaust, the endless grind of schedules and deadlines. So when a coworker mentioned he had a cousin who owned a small cabin way up north, somewhere deep in the woods near a lake, I didn't even think twice. I got the cousin's number, paid him a small rental fee, and a week later I packed my old SUV with a few days' worth of supplies, some books, a sleeping bag, and drove out of the city before the sun had even come up. The drive itself took about 8 hours. As the highways gave way to smaller roads and the smaller roads gave way to dirt tracks, I felt that tension in my chest finally start to loosen. I remember rolling down the windows even though the air was still chilly, just to smell the fresh trees, the dirt, the cold, clean air. The cabin was isolated. The last 10 miles were barely a road at all, just 2 deep ruts in the dirt winding through endless pines. I passed a few signs nailed to trees, private property, no trespassing, and some abandoned-looking mailboxes tilting at the ends of empty driveways. But mostly it was just trees. Miles and miles of trees. The cabin itself was older, small, and rough but sturdy. It sat maybe 100 yards off a little clearing, surrounded by thick woods. There was a gravel path leading up to it, a tiny porch with a broken swing hanging from rusted chains, and a roof covered in moss and brown pine needles. The whole place had a smell to it. Damp wood, cold stone, the faint stink of something left alone too long. But I didn't mind. It was exactly what I had wanted. Quiet, isolated, away from people. There was no electricity. The water came from a well with a hand pump. There was a big, ancient wood stove for heat, and stacks of chopped wood leaning against the side of the cabin. Inside, it was one big open room. A narrow bed against one wall, a beat-up couch against another, a tiny kitchen area with a wood counter and a sink that drained into a bucket. There was a little outhouse about 20 yards behind the cabin. After unloading my gear, I built a fire in the stove to warm the place up. I got the pump working, filling a few old jugs with water. I unpacked my food, mostly canned stuff, instant noodles, things that didn't need refrigeration, and set it on the counter. Then I just sat on the porch, breathing in the cold air and feeling more relaxed than I had in years. That first night, I slept like the dead. The wind made the trees creak and groan outside, and every now and then something would thump against the side of the cabin. A falling branch, maybe, or a raccoon, but it didn't bother me. I was used to sirens and shouting and garbage trucks rumbling past my window at 3 a.m. Out here, the noises of the forest were almost like music. The next morning, I took a walk down to the lake. It was maybe a 10-minute hike from the cabin, following a narrow path through the trees. The lake was beautiful, gray and glassy under the cloudy sky, with a little wooden dock jutting out into the water. I sat on the dock for a while, tossing pebbles into the water, watching the ripples spread out. I didn't see another person. I didn't even hear a plane overhead. That day passed lazily. I read for a while, cooked a simple meal on a propane camp stove, gathered some extra wood for the fire. Toward evening, it started to drizzle, so I stayed inside, listening to the soft patter of rain on the roof. By nightfall, the rain turned into a steady downpour. The woods outside grew darker and darker until they pressed against the windows like a living thing. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. First, I didn't know why. The rain was still coming down hard, and the wind had picked up, making the cabin groan and creak. But there was something else, a sound that didn't fit. A faint tapping noise, soft and irregular. I lay there in my sleeping bag, heart thudding, trying to tell myself it was just a branch tapping against the wall. Maybe a tree limb was scraping against the side of the cabin. I listened hard, straining to hear over the storm. Tap, tap, tap. It didn't sound like wood. It sounded sharper somehow, more deliberate. I told myself to stop being stupid. I was out in the woods. Of course I was going to hear weird noises. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me and closed my eyes. Eventually, I must have fallen back asleep, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The rain had stopped, and weak sunlight filtered through the window. I got up stiffly, stretched, and pulled on my boots. Stepping outside, I breathed in the damp, earthy smell of the forest after a rain. Everything was wet and shining. Puddles had formed in the dips in the ground. The gravel path was slick with mud. I glanced around the cabin, checking for fallen branches or storm damage. That's when I saw it. On the front door, at about chest height, there were scratches. Long, thin scratches, as if something with sharp nails had raked across the wood. They weren't deep, but they were definitely fresh. Tiny splinters of wood curled outward from the marks. I stood there for a long minute, staring at the scratches. My first thought was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog, but the marks seemed too high for a raccoon and too straight for an animal just clawing at the door. They looked purposeful. I shook it off. It was an old cabin, Maybe the scratches had been there and I just hadn't noticed. Or maybe something had stumbled against the door during the storm. I told myself it didn't matter. But all day, I couldn't shake a weird, prickling feeling, like someone was watching me from the woods. I kept glancing over my shoulder, peering into the trees. I didn't see anything, just the endless forest, dripping with rainwater. That night, I made sure to wedge a heavy chair under the door handle before I went to sleep. I felt a little ridiculous, but it made me feel better. I woke again in the middle of the night. This time it wasn't tapping. It was footsteps, soft, slow footsteps, crunching the wet gravel outside. I froze, every muscle locking up. I could hear them clearly, moving around the cabin. Slow, careful steps. Not an animal, not the wind, person. I lay there, barely breathing, listening. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then again. Then they stopped. Silence. Minutes dragged by. I stayed as still as I could. I didn't have a weapon, just a small hatchet I had been using to split kindling. It was leaning against the woodpile near the stove, too far to reach without making noise. I stayed awake until dawn, muscles aching, heart hammering. When the gray light finally started to seep into the cabin, I got up and pulled the chair away from the door. Slowly, I cracked it open and looked outside. The gravel was all churned up with footprints, muddy, half-washed away prints, circling the cabin again and again. I couldn't tell how many sets there were. Maybe one, maybe more. I wanted to believe it was a hunter, maybe someone from a neighboring property checking the place out. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Nobody wandered around cabins in the middle of a rainstorm in the dead of night. I thought about packing up and leaving right then. But the thought of that long drive back through the woods, alone, made me hesitate. Whoever it was might still be out there. Maybe it was safer to stay inside, lock the place up tight, and leave in broad daylight. I spent that day nervously. I didn't go down to the lake. I barely left the cabin. I kept the fire going, even though it wasn't that cold, just so I could have some light. I moved the hatchet closer to where I was sleeping. I hardly slept at all that night. Every noise outside made me jump. Every creak of the cabin made me sweat. But nothing happened. No footsteps, no tapping, just the endless dark pressing against the windows. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed up quickly, stuffing everything back into my duffel bags. I went outside to load up the SUV, glancing around the woods every few seconds. That's when I noticed the woods were quieter than they should have been. No birds, no squirrels, just silence, heavy and unnatural. I loaded the last bag into the back of the SUV and slammed the hatch shut. I turned to head back into the cabin for one final check, and that's when I saw the figure, standing at the edge of the trees, not moving, just standing there, half hidden behind a tree trunk. I froze. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man. Tall, thin, wearing dark clothes. I couldn't see his face. He wasn't moving, just watching. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run. I didn't even lock the cabin behind me. I just ran for the driver's seat, yanked open the door, jumped in, and slammed the door shut. Fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them. Finally, I got the engine started. I slammed the SUV into reverse, backed up fast enough to spray mud everywhere, then tore out down the dirt track, fishtailing around the first corner. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if he was following. The drive back to the main road felt endless. Every shadow between the trees looked like a person. Every bump